Are we seen or what?
Yeah, we should be going live in a second.
Oops. Shit, I don't want to mess with that.
Okay, it takes a while. You gotta push from Zoom out. And here we are. Oh my goodness. Oh, Dan.
Are we up? Are we
We're
up?
live. Yeah. So you can move. Hey, we're here.
Whoa.
Oh my goodness.
Everything,
oh my goodness.
Fun with me.
We're happening now, and we're on twice. Right. This is how we have mastered the art of going live on Facebook. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm Emil Guillermo. I am your museum director of the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum. And if you were here early to catch our preview, usually we have a preview, but we were desperately trying to figure out, what did we do wrong? Why isn't Facebook working? But we got it working, and I'm joined by Professor Dan Gonzales of San Francisco State University. Hey, Dan, thank you for being here. And once again, I apologize to you. I apologize to the people out there, because we build this up as a, the museum is closed. The museum is closed again. But, even though the state says close, the county says close, our volunteers say, oh, our health, we should close. We will be open. We will be open virtually. And so we have the virtual FANHS Museum. So here we are. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And
for having me. It's great to be with you.
And yeah. Well, I mean, we had hoped to have some people, at 2:00, because we said, we're going to go on at 2:00, but believe me, it's harder to do these things sometimes. And it's just sort of like if you came to the museum in Stockton and couldn't find a parking space and had to go around and around. It's like that. But this is a lot easier. You stayed home, and maybe you took a glimpse of a game or something. But here I am. I am dedicated to do this for you, this virtual museum, because people can't come to the FANHS Museum now. And darn it, just because we're closed, you can still come and get an experience of the kind of programs that we put on every third Sunday at 2:00 at the FANHS Museum. Now, I thought this was going to be a pretty interesting week, because a confluence of many things came up, including the anniversary, I guess that's the way you call it, the anniversary of the assassination of Benigno Aquino. He went from the U.S. to Manila, and on the tarmac, he was gunned down in 1983 on August 21st. That's a little bit of history that must be noted. This also was the week for the Democratic National Conventions, or convention, it's singular, but there were 4 days of it. That's worth commenting on. We come to a week where we're about to start the Republican National Convention. And I want to mention to everyone, as a kind of disclosure, we are nonpartisan at the museum. The views expressed here are of the people expressing them and not of the museum. But we try at the museum to be nonpartisan. We're only covering politics because this is part of Filipino American life, the politics of it. So all those things I mentioned, right? We're sandwiched between the Democrat and the Republican conventions. We've got the anniversary of Ninoy Aquino, and then we have the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. And at the convention, the Democratic convention, we have Kamala Harris being named vice president, perhaps the closest an Asian American has been to becoming the president of the United States. This is some confluence of stuff, don't you think, Dan Gonzales?
I do. I do. I do. I do. I do. Yeah, it is.
I mean, first of all, I mean, it's so much stuff, and there's a lot to unpack. I'm just sort of setting the scene, and of all the people who knows Filipino American history and how the politics has evolved, I thought of you immediately because that's one of the key things, one of the key courses you teach at the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State. So, and there's also one more thing to mention. We've got the Maria Ressa's her arrest, and we have what's going on with ABS-CBN and all that's happening in the Philippines. And there are Filipinos here who are looking at that more closely than they are looking at anything going on here. So
how about the census?
And we have the census too. All right, if we can get to the census too. In other words, there's a lot of stuff. And so I that's why I thought to have you on. And let's start with the earliest thing I mentioned, which is 1983, the assassination of Benigno Aquino. A lot of people won't think that, oh, that's not Filipino American history, but how would you put that in a Filipino American history context?
Big mistake.
Yeah, how would you put that into a Filipino American history context?
If you're going to do it in full context, you have to talk about the declaration of martial law, and then you have to talk about the resistance, or at least mention it, and then talk about the diaspora, especially the early expat diaspora, which included much of the leadership that was anti-martial law and anti-Marcos at the time. I mean, basically there was a complete congruence between being anti-martial law and being anti-Marcos. And Mr. Aquino and several members of his family were prominent figures,
right,
in the resistance. So was the Lopez family. Several members of the Lopez family resided here in the Bay Area. So did at least two of Benigno's sisters.
Right.
One a very prominent news director with KGO on the ABC affiliate, Channel
right.
7.
Lupita Kashiwara, and also Tessie Areta, who was a senator in the Philippines. They were living in Daly City. So
Westlake, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, for people to say that whole thing is not a part of Filipino American politics,
yeah,
I think is short-sighted. They missed the point.
Well, I made an argument at one time when Guerrero was still working for the Chronicle, and she did an interview on me, and I said that, there's like three big cities that have a lot to do with the politics in the Philippines and that are going to influence the outcome of the presidential election, the snap election in '86. And I said, and none of them are in the Philippines.
Yeah,
it's a pretty nasty statement.
Right, they're all here. They're all here in America. I remember in the '80s covering Henny Lopez. Henny Lopez, whose family founded ABS-CBN. I mean, they are ABS-CBN. That's the link going forward to today, how ABS-CBN was shut down by the Philippine government. So it's all kind of convoluted. When you talk about Filipino American politics, you can't not also talk about Filipino politics. It's kind of intertwined, right?
The patriarch of the family lived over in the Golden Gate high rises.
Yeah.
His daughter Tracy was married to Sinakis, and they lived here in San Francisco. Henny had a house on Stonecrest, which was about 300 yards from the front of San Francisco State University.
Right.
So when immediately after the assassination, a lot of people warned him not to go back.
You're talking about Aquino, Benigno Aquino, back in
August. A lot
August.
of people warned him not to go back, but there was a significant amount of pressure, on the other hand, for somebody to change what was going on, to challenge directly what was going on in the Philippines. And there were a number of people who were talking about the possibility of going back, especially when the announcement of a snap election came up.
Right.
I remember Raul Mangapos talking about that, and he was seen as a contender. Mitra was a contender. The brother-in-law of Alex Exclamado, who founded and ran the Philippine News originally, that newspaper.
Out of South San Francisco.
Out of South. Well, yeah. When he started, he was right here in San Francisco on Lawton Street. We're going back to our childhood now, but
That's right. They were in the sunset.
We first met when you were still live TV doing stand up for either Kron or KPIX.
Well, yeah. It was
both of us received some kind of award in the mid '80s.
That's a funny picture. If someone digs that up, but
why is that funny? I think we look damn good in that picture. But anyway, it's cool.
They should preserve that picture.
Yeah. Well,
but Dan, so Aquino's assassination important because it establishes once again this theme that what happens in the Philippines is important to Filipino American politics. But if we go back in history, this is true ever since the Filipino American War, because even in 1924, when in America harsh immigration laws were passed,
right,
the Philippines was exempted because they were nationals, right?
Well,
they were considered American nationals.
Flew over the Philippines since 1899. But yes, I think even before the United States actually laid claim to the Philippines as a territorial protectorate. Remember that language?
Yeah.
And they contorted themselves and tied themselves into a pretzel to avoid the use of the word colonialism.
Colonialism.
It's the word of a colony. But anyway, and
but it was.
It's an outright colony. So yeah, that's when the serious stuff started. So-called self-governance. I know you'll remember this. 1913 in the passages of the Jones Law. Remember that?
Yeah.
And they let Filipinos sit in the lower house, essentially, of a Congress, but everything was still run by all the people in the upper house. It was still U.S. rule outright. So yes, they started recruiting already from the Philippines, U.S. Navy directly in the first decade, right? I think as early as 1906, they established an American school system.
Yeah.
And recruited newly arrived immigrants from Europe and England, I should say the British Isles, right? Because they were Irish, Scots, and everybody, and they couldn't get jobs because of bias here in the U.S. and the continental U.S. And so many of them took jobs in Cuba and in the Philippines. And so people think of them as all missionaries, and many of them were in fact Christian missionaries. So this has a cultural effect on the Philippines. It has an institutional effect because now English is going to become essentially the language of trade and politics in the Philippines. And Tagalog would not be established as the national language until 1938, right? So there's not more than a full generation that are exposed to the Americanization of the Philippines before the Tagalog is made the national language. And then when it was made the national language, there was resistance from the north, from the Ilocanos, as well as from the south, from the Bisayans, particularly the Cebuanos, right? And so, the influence of the United States is one thing, the direct political and economic influence, and also the extraction of goods, semi-finished products, raw materials, right? That's the basic history all the way up to and including the rise of Marcos, right?
Now, see, this is important that you paint all this background, because what I'm trying to do is to help people understand when they say, well, why are the Filipinos the way they are? Well, where are the Filipino leaders? Where are the Filipino politicians? Why was it the first Filipino state legislator in California? Only Rob Bonta just recently, within the last, 5 or 6 years. Oh, what happened? And
Right.
you don't quite understand it unless you understand the relationship that begins with the colonial times. And then even as Filipinos immigrated here in the 20s and 30s, my father came in 1928. What happens with 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act? It essentially says, oh, you American nationals, you Filipinos who are American, we're changing your status. We're
Right.
now repatriating you, go home. So if you're here as an American, how important of a, or how valued as an American are you when now suddenly you've got to duck this notion of self-repatriation or self-deportation, essentially?
And that was also the beginning of the criticism from Filipinos in the U.S. of Philippine policy, Philippine government policy, because with Tidings McDuffie, what people look at is the promise, right, of Philippine independence by 1945. Of course, the Second World War interrupted that by about a year, but that promise of independence persuaded a lot of people that good things would come. But
Yeah.
the Philippine nationalism was not supportive of the condition and circumstance of Filipinos here in the United States, and they were very political. Um, there were more than 40 newspapers.
Yeah.
It's kind of an inside joke for Filipino historians, right? You get two Filipinos, you get an argument. You get three Filipinos, they start a newspaper. And
They love their Filipinos love newspapers, both in the Philippines and here in the United States.
yep, yep, yep.
You
It's
can't
and
go to a
it's
place.
hard to do. It's hard. I still have a tough time understanding how they all get enough support, right? Some enough income or revenue to be able to run, because that's a lot of advertising you got to get,
But Dan, that is exactly how the news came from the Philippines to the Filipino communities. You know,
Yeah,
even Stockton had a Filipino newspaper, the Three Stars, which,
yeah,
if in Don Mabalan's book, Little Manila is in the Heart, she quotes really liberally from D.L. Marquelo, who is the editor and publisher of the Three Stars. And
right.
of course, where else but in the Three Stars, just a week ago, August 15th, it was another anniversary, August 15th, 1930, the Three Stars reported Filipinos lynched, in Lodi, California. You didn't see it in the mainstream newspapers, but you did see it in the Philippine newspapers, the Three
Didn't
Stars.
you worked on documenting that, did you not?
Yeah, I know. Well, pretty much it was Dawn's work. She at the labor libraries, but this is the thing about all the researchers of Filipinos in the 20s and 30s and 40s. A lot of them were dependent on uh, the news, the Philippine ethnic press, which is why I've continued writing for the ethnic press. And just as a side note, I want to acknowledge when I wrote a piece, and this is a piece that was footnoted in Don's book. I wrote a piece in Asian Week, which is more broadly Asian than Filipino.
I
But
really missed that publication.
oh yeah, yeah.
It's really good.
But I also wrote versions of it for Filipino papers about how Carlos Bulasan had an FBI file that went into his background and his past. And the main source and the main researcher of that was Marilyn Alcazola's husband,
Lane.
Lane
Lane just
Hirabayashi,
passed away. He just
passed
passed
away.
away. Yeah.
And I just found out about it last night, and that's a real. I mean, he's another Asian American scholar like yourself. I mean,
Well, his first full-time job where he got tenured was at SF State.
yeah.
He
I mean,
had been split between UCLA and UC Irvine before that. And yeah,
well, I just want to acknowledge Lane, and his research and work, and how it was. This is the thing that happens with information. There's the scholars who get to do the research. There's the journalists who disseminate the research. There's the museums who try to enshrine or at least be a place where the public can get access to the research, and we all work together so that people get an understanding of the truth. So,
Actually, historians often rely on historical journalism for the basis of their positions. So
yeah,
they're relying on journalistic professionalism and integrity, because that's where a lot of people, I think one of the strongest arguments that I heard for that came from, God, I'm trying to mention his name. He used to teach at Ohlone College. He retired.
oh yeah, yeah. I recall his name. I recall him. I don't recall his name.
Yeah,
But he
I'm
was
trying
at
to
Luna.
remember. I'll remember it when we're done.
But you're right. The historical journalism, or journalism which brings forth the past into the present and writes about it in a way. I mean, they say first draft of history, but there are subsequent drafts, and
Yeah, that's right.
at some point, the historians pick it up, and then they make the grander story or make the grander case for their their theses, and that's how it works. And at the museum, we say you don't have to be an academic to understand or to experience or live through history. But like I said, let's get back into this whole thing about how
The
America,
Philippines, what happens in the Philippines?
how Filipino American politics gets overly dependent on what happens in the Philippines. So, and if you understand the relationship of Filipinos, how when they even when they came here in the 20s and 30s, and how they were, and through World War II, was, I mean, I know there were Filipino communities, and they were very prideful about their, once again, looking back to their provinces. I went to so many United Laogueño parties. There's the there's the Cavitans, and there's all these community groups. But while there were competition to see who would be the queen or the king or the president of the Laogueños, there wasn't really any sense of, well, I want to be supervisor, or I want to be mayor of San Francisco, or I want to be mayor of Daly City. I mean, it was really still kind of Filipino extra provincial here in America.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that is because of institutional racism.
Yeah.
There's institutional racism, there's colonial mentality, and those two things together limit the way people see their role in American society. And that's not just true for Filipinos. There were times when Filipinos tried to develop political standing, but they did it by associating with established white politicians. And so Moncado, right? Hilario Camino Moncado is a good example of that. He started the FFA, the Federation of Filipino Americans, and it was an umbrella organization that embraced a number of less populous organizations, and he was very effective in organizing elements of the Filipino American community, and he actually helped to cultivate not only a cultural leadership but a political leadership even before the Second World War. But his intentions, as most historians point out, was to develop enough political clout. He made a lot of money initially as a labor contractor,
right?
But then he made other investments as well and became a millionaire, and that is really something. A Filipino having that status, and being a millionaire back then was like being a billionaire today.
Right.
But his objective was to become president of the Philippines. He was an interesting character, but he made his political mark in the U.S. and particularly in California by being the only Filipino member, and I think the only non-white member of the Philippine Society, which was a very political group that influenced what U.S. policy would be in the Philippines, even though it was largely a California organization. He was a member of that, and the only non-white member of the Philippine Society. So on the other hand, you have Filipinos who had experienced early labor organizing in the Philippines, and who came to the United States for the same reasons everybody else did, and that was for job opportunities and to be able to send money back to the Philippines. You know, a lot of the old timers sent, 80%, anywhere from
Right.
50 to 80% of their income back to the Philippines. But among those people were people like Bolosan, the Gonzales brothers, and the leader of the people who established FLU, right, the Filipino Labor Union in
Right.
Hawaii.
And this really was where, if there was any kind of political attraction, they were moved to better Filipino labor, the Filipino labor situation. But ultimately, their goal, for most of them, was to go back to the Philippines, right?
Yeah, I think that was what they were hoping.
I mean, they always had an eye. They always had an eye toward the
It was
Philippines.
that was their initial attitude. I heard it was when I was growing up.
Yeah.
I heard, yeah, I'm going to retire and go back to the Philippines and live happily after under a coconut tree, or some somewhat poetic statement like that. And a lot of them did, to get married, right?
Right.
Frequently at a very late age, like in their 50s and even early 60s, they would go back to get married, marry a much younger woman, and then come back here. So there's a lot of families with kids. I'm sure you know some of these families.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where,
Well,
their dad was like 20, 25 years older than their mom. And, the kids suffered for that because people would say, oh, that your grandfather, that kind of thing. And
I mean, hey, that was my situation too, right? I mean, my father was, 20, 25 years older than me, but this is,
no, older than your mom.
oh, well, actually, yeah, older than my mom too.
I mean, but how much older?
Um, quite a bit. You know, my mom always looked so young. I just
Yeah,
discovered a
yeah.
picture. I just discovered a picture of their wedding picture. They may not have been 25 years older, but I know, they were, but there was a gap. There was definitely a gap. But the kind of relationships that you describe, typical of the Central Valley. And one of the things are, we talk about how, I mean, but it does show how for Filipinos to come here, they weren't really in any position to become. I mean, you talked about Mancado, the only
Yeah.
Filipino among whites, but who was talking about organizing Filipinos if it weren't?
Well, but he was organizing Filipinos. He was a right winger in essence. He would correspond to a person of color who was a Trumper.
Oh yeah.
He would
Well,
correspond to that. And on the other hand, you had the critics who were coming from the left, and that included Pablo Manapit, for example,
yeah.
as in direct opposition. He was a union organizer, and he was punished for it, along with the other members of FLU.
Well, we'll talk about, the most prominent name to come out, later on in the 60s because of the grape strike was Larry Itliong.
Yeah.
And that's where Dawn's book really soars. She talked about how the labor rights issue and the civil rights issues merging, and it was really the beginning of Filipinos seeing themselves in a new way, right? Because now we have Itliong advocating for Filipinos, older Filipinos, mind you, from Hermanos, but we also had people from the Marcos era coming in, I mean, same time, because
essentially political refugees. Yes.
yeah, because political refugees until 65, when the immigration laws were changed and more Filipinos were allowed in.
Well,
But
if you talk about even before 65, there was small numbers of immigrants. Okay. but the limitation was like 110, I think, per
Right.
year
110 immigrants. Very,
after
very, very minimal. Yeah.
yeah, very minimal. So that was the annual migration of Filipinos under those restrictions. Prior to 1965, it was like I've had more people than that in one section of one class. you
Yeah.
know, in one semester at school. Now, but you also have to look at what kind of immigrants came in between 46 and 65, and a lot of them were students,
Right.
and a lot of them were nurses. So even before, a lot of people use 65 as the marker for nurses, but the reality is they were being recruited uh, minimally, but even before the war, they were being recruited by some universities and colleges. My colleague at UC Berkeley, of course, has written on this extensively. But
Kathy
uh,
Choi.
yeah, Catherine Choi, really good stuff. But the post 65 immigration of nurses was ridiculous. I mean, the number of nurses, even today, when I ask students, and that's about Philippine policy too, right? I mean, you build universities, many of them world class in terms of the quality of education that people are getting, but you can't hire everybody. They just don't have the economy. They don't have the infrastructure to employ all of those people. So the Philippines was already set up for massive emigration, out migration, even before 1965.
Yeah.
Okay, some of my relatives came in as nurses before 1965. Some went to Canada first, right, and then migrated into the central area of the United States, like Detroit. I don't know why Detroit specifically, but they there was a bookstore that essentially ran a national book service for Filipino materials in Detroit. I think it was Cellar Bookshop. You remember that?
I don't recall that, but
Cellar, Cellar. And then, of course, San Francisco started to develop a couple of bookstores. But we used to pull all our stuff through radical Asian American bookstores, right? Like East Wind Books and
right.
People's, everybody's bookstore. Was super left.
But now, when you state all this, it helps to clarify why Filipinos have such a delayed response, or how they have been somewhat how do you it would explain why Filipinos aren't as developed, aren't as mature, I mean, in a political sense, because they've had all these obstacles in the way of their migration to America. They were never really seen as fully American.
Well, there was a constant migration, especially after 1965. It's been very constant. I think you got to really look at institutional racism, and you also have to look at class.
Right.
Prior to 1965, with the exception of those students that I just mentioned and other members of professional class, there were a few business people. There were some military who came here for training, but they went back to the Philippines right after their training, specialized training. So you had a very small community, but it was very self-contained, and it didn't have the economic standing that the Chinese American community had, for example, in San Francisco. And you had to have a strong economic base in order to do anything more than support white politicians who were running for office that might give an ear, right, to Filipino issues and Filipino circumstances and conditions. We never developed that. We never developed a center. People looked at Daly City and said, "Well, that's gonna be the place that develops a core of capable Filipino political leadership and people who can run for office." And they were also looking at population density, right? That there's going to be a critical mass of Filipino population in Daly City. But that didn't work out the way people assumed either, because a lot of the Filipinos did not put much emphasis on crossing over ethnic lines and getting support from the majority white population, largely Irish and Italian descent, just like San Francisco, where,
Right.
huge portions of the population are Irish and Italian descent. You have to cross those ethnic lines. And the
Yeah, that's
Filipinos, there were very few Mexican Americans that were living anywhere but Daly City and Colma, right? The population in San Francisco was Central American and maybe three different countries, right? Uh, Salvadoreños, Guatemalans, and Nicaraguans, right? Nicaraguenses. And so they were also in conflict. So Filipinos, a lot of the regional stuff, the geographic stuff, and especially the issue of Marcos, even before the declaration of martial law. But after the declaration of martial law, the vast majority of Filipinos supported that. And so there was only a minority of Filipinos on the left that were adamantly opposed to martial law. That movement grew, but it grew also because people were escaping persecution and prosecution in the Philippines under the Marcos administration and coming to San Francisco. So that was a huge influence.
yeah.
But again, it divided the community. So there's going to be people who want to run for political office, who put themselves up for appointments, right, by elected officials into important commissions, statewide, locally, countywide, citywide, municipal organizations. Running from boards of education would be a good idea. That's a good place to start, obviously, and several Filipinos have done that successfully, but not that many have moved up, right, into the state legislature.
But once again, this split, this divide, how Filipinos take their cue from the Philippines, and it's kind of helped create this slowness and
the person who's running for political office has a strong position. Marcos, even now, anti-Marcos, pro-Marcos. If their family had a background on anti or pro-Marcos position, anti or pro-martial law position, the other portion of the opposed population ain't going to vote for him. It's that simple. And so there's going to be a lot of divisions within the community itself. And so what people assume to be a community that's going to vote to support their Filipino contestant, right, for political office may not be there. There certainly won't be there in 100% or 80%. There's going to be division. There was one time when 5 seats opened up in Daly City in the 1980s. 5 seats for city council opened up in Daly City. 5 Filipinos ran for them.
Yeah. And did all 5 get in or none? I know. I was saying
that's bad math. I mean, that's just bad math. But that's, the expected happened. Nobody got elected, right? So yeah.
Well, so Dan, let's bring it forward to issues of today. We don't have Marcos, we have Duterte. Is Marcos Duterte or
really
Duterte
popular.
Marcos?
He's really popular in the Philippines.
Yeah, he's a populist, but he's also authoritarian. He's been under attack for his human rights, alleged human rights violations in terms of dealing with drugs. The latest thing is his heavy-handedness toward Maria Ressa, the Rappler editor, and ABS-CBN, and Filipinos here, when they could look at, say, the current 2020 American, political situation. I have friends in the Washington, D.C. area who are part of Filipino groups who say, I hang out with these Filipinos and they are more concerned with what's going on in the Philippines than they are here. They don't care about Trump. They care about what's going on in Duterte, what's going on with the people in the Philippines. How does that happen? Is it just because those are urgent matters, like the stripping of press freedom, the stripping of ABS-CBN, which is an important thing? I mean, it's important to stand up for ABS-CBN if you believe in a free press. But why is it that you have that? It's almost like maybe almost like a replication of
It is.
the
It is
Marcos.
in good part. That's a good point. It is in good part, substantial part, right? A replication, and it's about identity. Um, Among the upper middle class and upper class uh, people who came to the United States during the martial law period, they developed the term to describe themselves as expats, right? Expatriates. And to put the emphasis on being an expatriate means that your identity lies with the Philippines, right? You're an expat. You are from the Philippines, and so that attitude is reflected as well in the general population of first generation Filipino immigrants. They see themselves as Filipino. They reject the use of the term Filipino American. I'm sure you witnessed this when we used the term Filipino American as student political activists. We were criticized for wanting to identify in any portion with the term American. There were some people who would prefer to put American in front of Filipinos and call themselves American Filipinos.
I think I did. I think I would.
Maybe you did, but because and the understanding was we were born here. We have an American consciousness, American cultural foundation, and there's a limited amount for my generation. I'm a little bit older than you, but I think we're in the same generation. But I'm older than you are. There were little cultural points of cultural reference. Nobody was teaching history.
Yeah.
Philippine history or Filipino American history. Hardly anyone was teaching language. That was more of an informal educational process that was done at the familial level, not at an institutional level of a community school. The closest that we had to the transportation and the translation of Philippine culture to Filipinos in the United States was dance organizations, folk dance groups, of which there were several. They did communicate some level of cultural knowledge and understanding, but it was limited. Food.
So Dan, did we do it to ourselves?
We hardly had any Filipino restaurants. The only Filipino restaurants were Kearney Street.
Yeah.
And they were small little cafes, and they had very limited down home style cooking, but it was the typical, lumpia, pancit, adobo stuff, dinuguan, like that.
So Dan, did we do it to ourselves? Did we do it to ourselves by, or is this just years of this, of having to, endure everything that's gone on since the colonial age, right?
Yeah. I think it's changed. It changed gradually from the youth, even before the Second World War, because there was a smaller population, but there was a second generation of Filipinos born in the United States before the Second World War. And a lot of those people they became mentors to us who were the so-called radical activists of the 1960s. They were not nearly as radical, although some were quite liberal in their political perspectives. The greater likelihood was that they were kind of middle of the road or even conservative. They were conservative in the classic sense. People are confusing the people who label themselves as conservative today. Oh, my phone just cut out, but you can still see me?
I can still see you. I can hear you too.
So I guess it was the screen turned off, but it's behaving weirdly right now. It's telling me hello, like it's restarting and doing all that kind of stuff. But I can still see myself on screen too. But anyway, so where was I? That generation really accomplished a lot. Many of them went on to college. They excelled in athletics as well as at all of the major subjects in high school. They made it into college. My phone just, can you still see me?
I can, well,
No, not anymore, huh?
I don't see you now. But I can hear you.
Okay.
Professor Daniel Phil Gonzales is not seen because his camera has conked out on us, but he can still talk to us, right,
Yeah,
Dan?
I still can. I'm trying to get the thing back online. I wonder why it did that.
Maybe power. You can power up or not
I'm
power
gonna,
up.
I'm
Plug
gonna,
it in.
yeah, I'm gonna plug in and see what
You
happens.
plug it in. We apologize. We're live though. I mean, it's something to go live here at the museum. I know ordinarily you'd say, "Oh, it's the weekend. Let us drive to the FANHS Museum in Stockton." But we're closed. We can't open up. We're closed. So, Emil Guillermo, as museum director, is doing this virtual thing so that he, the museum is wherever you are, and hopefully wherever you are, still within driving distance of Stockton. Maybe not. Maybe you're somewhere else. But this is a way to experience the kind of programs we do every third Sunday at 2 p.m. Pacific at the museum, and then when we were open. But we'll continue to do them. I mean, we're not waiting. We kept waiting for the museum to open, but we're not going to wait anymore because who knows when we're going to be open again. And so we'll do this virtual, and we will try to get us transformed into a virtual museum so that the museum is where you are. So pleased again to have Professor Dan Gonzales with us from San Francisco State talking about the evolution of Filipino American history. We're going to talk about the Democrats and the Republicans and the census soon, but Dan,
It's the political environment where we lived as well. So for example, in Seattle, people were getting appointed
yeah,
to commissions, committee, and staff positions, working with politicians in Seattle, even as early as the 50s in the post World War II era. And a lot of that was because of the strength of the ILWU and Ukapawa, right? The cannery workers union, farm workers union before them. And so ILWU Local 37 was populated by a lot of leftists. In fact, they were accused of being communists and were in danger of being imprisoned and then deported after serving their prison sentences here in the United States in the early 1950s. And they got good lawyers and they actually won their case. They lost in Seattle, but then their case went up on appeal to the Ninth Circuit right here in San Francisco, and they won that appeal, and it didn't go forward. The prosecution did not go forward on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. But anyway, so there are people who were born before the Second World War that take advantage of a strong public educational system, sometimes private education if they had enough money. And then during the Second World War, many of them volunteered as teenagers to join the war effort in the Pacific Theater, and they joined the Filipino infantries that were founded in Salinas originally, right? My father was one of them, but a lot of the people who joined as teenagers looked up to the so-called Manong generation, their elders who were old enough to be their fathers. They actually were old enough to be their fathers. My father was in his mid-30s at the time. There were people, 38 years old was the cut line, right? But a lot of the old timers lied about their age in order to serve. They actually reduced their age and kept it under 38 so that they could serve. And the teenagers remembered that. They felt a great deal of utang, debt,
right.
to the old timers for helping them stay alive and come back from that war. And when we were, one of the reasons I got that award that we received in the 80s was because I had worked on the Presidio exhibit of Filipinos in the U.S. Army. And a lot of the old timers were still alive. And I took my knowledge and history from them. It was an incredible exhibit that went up. It was really well done. all credit deserving to the director, museum director, was Eric Saul, Jewish gentleman. I should get in touch with Eric and find out what he's doing. I'm trying to zoom up again and get the camera back on right now.
Well, that's all right. We can still hear you. You know, there's a couple questions that have come up. One is a question to you, Dan. It says, there were Filipinos who were not decolonized when they arrived here in America. They likely believed that the Philippines should have been the 51st state and the white man is the leader.
That's true.
What do you say to that?
That's true. I mean, it's true that there were some Filipinos who thought that the Philippines should be, at the time, the 48th state.
Right.
And there have been arguments like that since then. You're supposed to let me in.
Oh, I think I did.
Okay, well.
No, I didn't let you in. Hold on.
Well, right now.
Yeah.
Okay, wait. Something's happening.
We're not exactly in sync here because I think there's a little bit of lag.
Okay.
But now you just need to turn your camera on.
It says you are.
This is the great thing about technology, everyone, that we can communicate live in real time, sort of, because there's slight lag going from Zoom to Facebook. So it's like, it's not Facebook, it's face.
I got to remember that.
So, but we're communicating, and this is the museum. This is the museum virtually. Let's see.
Nah, forget it. I mean, I don't want to be playing with this thing and being distracted from our conversation. So
okay,
I'll
all
just,
right.
you know, you're better looking anyway. So.
Oh, that's well, that's kind of you to say, but.
Yeah, no, it just happens to be true. I deal in fact here. Anyway,
Okay.
there were people who in Seattle got appointments. They started naming bridges and stuff after Filipinos. Filipinos started getting local residents and artists, some of whom were like Val Ligo, Dorothy Cordova's brother. You know, Val Ligo got artist space, and there's sculptures that are dedicated to the Filipino community right across from in the park, right across from the Veterans Administration Hospital, up on Veterans Hill in Seattle. And there's a partially cast iron bridge that's the roadway up to the hospital, and the name of that bridge is the Jose Rizal Bridge. And this is long before, you know, the community in San Francisco started getting streets named after Filipinos. So there was a strong sense of cultural nationalism, and we're talking about a largely first generation population, but there was also the power of the unions, okay, right. particularly the ILWU, Local 37, and they were persecuted as communists. There were socialists among their leadership. The rank and file was not necessarily all socialist, certainly. But they beat the prosecution, and that's one of the reasons that the Seattle Filipino community thrives. It's one of the reasons that FANHS, right, was initiated by people living in Seattle, even though many of them were originally from Stockton. You know,
right. Well, it seems to me like there is a clear class division when you talk about Filipinos and labor unions, and Filipinos who
Absolutely.
were involved in all white organizations, and they probably had more money. And in many cases, post 65, they came over as doctors, right? They came over as, professionals, accountants,
teachers. Many of them were teachers. Even before 65, a lot of teachers came, and they adjusted their status. They moved from students and people finishing their advanced degrees, and adjusted their status to permanent residence, and then made themselves eligible for citizenship if they wanted it. But it was relatively easy then for people to adjust their status from tourist or student over to permanent resident.
So jump over or jump several decades to now from the 60s and 70s. That's like 50 years or so.
Mhm.
Has it changed much, or how has it impacted where where we are right now, and how Filipino politics plays in Filipino American politics plays, given the current situation in America, in the U.S.
Ooh.
The class thing is still pretty
Oh,
fundamental, right?
yeah, yeah.
I mean, if you came post 65 with means, or even if you came post 80, or in many cases post 2000, I
I
mean,
think it's, you know what? I think it's more if immigrant first generation are generally more conservatively inclined.
mm,
It doesn't matter what era they came in, whether or not it was early, from 65 to 75, let's say,
mm,
uh, whether it was during the entire period of martial law, which lasted officially only about 9 years, right?
right,
But as a practical matter, it lasted as long as Mr. Marcos remained in office, all the way up until 86. Or if it was post 86, uh, it doesn't make that much difference. The first generation generally is more conservative. Now, there was one major exception, and that was the people who were avoiding persecution and prosecution, right, under martial law.
right.
And that was largely a class thing, you know, because there were people who were student activists, political activists, who were sometimes already imprisoned and tortured, and
Yeah,
then were able to escape. There were other people like the Lopez's and the Osmeñas, right,
right.
who were
Well,
able to escape. And ABS CBM is still a Lopez thing, right? So why
right.
are they being attacked now? For the same reason they were attacked by Marcos in the 70s.
Well, talk about strange bedfellows. I mean, you had radicals who left the Philippines under persecution, and you had rich people who left who left
And
the
we're
Philippines.
arriving at the same time, and the activism occurred a few blocks apart
Right.
because
And
because
they became the community here in America, which was really strange to see the protesters drive up in Mercedes Benzes, and but that was the 80s and the 90s, and then people power happened, and that kind of petered out, and you could see that through the years, from the end of people power, and then through all the other Macapagal Arroyo, and the actor, Estrada, and and
yeah,
another Aquino. Yeah, I mean, where are we now? It almost seems destined to come back to Duterte, Mr. Strongman
and
from,
he's
you know,
popular. He is popular in the Philippines.
and he's popular. Well, he's popular here in a negative way, because it seems like there's a lot of Fil-Ams, or Filipino Americans, who want to take a stand against him in the Philippines
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
much stronger way than they'll take a stand here in American politics.
yeah. Well, the people who are being punished are the Filipinexes, right?
Mhm.
The people who identify with Filipinx. That notion of Filipinos in the U.S. in the United States. The and they're
Wait,
young.
wait, Dan, hold on a second. Before you go on, uh, I've seen Filipinx, like Latinx. Some
Mhm.
people might say Philippinx. It's not Philippinx. It's Filipinx.
Right.
Uh, Don Mabalan in her book said Filipina-O, so that there was no masculine and feminine. But now, what are they doing with
Should also
Filipinx?
use the at symbol. They
Yeah,
also use the at symbol because it has an A surrounded by a three-quarter circle, so it looks like AO.
I see.
Yeah.
Because in her book it says Philippine A/O,
Oh, that's correct.
or Philippine and then the at sign,
Right, right.
which is sort of like, is that like self-deportation? Philippine at going backwards? Just a joke, just a joke. But,
Oh,
but what is it,
you,
Dan?
you got me to giggle on that one. Yeah.
What is it, Dan, about Filipinx? How do you define it, and how do people relate to it?
Oh,
If
it adds sexuality. So it's all
okay.
inclusive. Okay, it's meant to be all inclusive, and it's also meant to move away from American.
Yeah,
Okay, the
yeah,
Filipino American, right? So it went Filipino, and then Filipino.
right.
Okay, we got scolded for that. I was alone on that island when I said no. Using Filipino is inaccurate because that only refers to the language. They changed Tagalog to Filipino to encourage a greater degree of national embrace. But people here didn't listen to me, and so I was alone locally on saying no. Filipino is correct with an F.
Mm.
People thought they were doing all kinds of cultural stuff and saying, "No, wait a minute. What about the fact that Filipinos can't pronounce the F? You know, there's so many Filipinos that say Filipino. You know, and but FANHS and the Cordovas also said, yeah, Filipino is not correct. And then Filipino teachers and immigrants from the Philippines said, yeah, Filipino refers to the language and only the language. With the F, it refers to the people, right? And then with the PH,
Yeah.
it's an adjective, right? Or it refers to the Anglo version of the reference to
So,
the Philippines.
so what is now my contribution to all this is I wrote a column at least 10 years ago where I said the term American Filipino, this is who we are, and I included the immigrants as well as people who were born here. I didn't want to say
Well,
here's the nativists and here's the American.
well, but you would have been okay with that because you're right. See, a lot of the first generation immigrants don't want to be American. Well, they don't want to be labeled as American,
Right.
and because that's like uh, who was it that didn't take American citizenship? I think it was. I hope I'm correct on this, but it was either Emil Gonzales or Ben Santos, but
Oh,
Bienvenido Santos. But one of them did not accept American citizenship, even though they resided here
right.
for most of their lives. And Santos went back to the Philippines eventually, but Gonzales was suffering from cancer for about 10 years, and I believe he passed away here. But anyway,
Two great writers, incidentally.
yeah, to be celebrated for different reasons. Yeah.
All right. So American
So my
Filipino
point,
was seen as correct by some people.
yeah, but a small minority,
Right.
and it's people who wanted to assert that it was more than okay to define yourself in those terms. The problem was you would be rejected by the vast majority of the people in our ethnic community because as it is today, more than 60% of our community is still first generation.
Right.
Okay, so they get to define from their perspective what is a real Filipino. Okay, they get to define what is a real Ilocano, what is a real Cebuano, and so that's part of the problem. It's hard to establish unity, particularly political unity, when you have those kinds of divisions.
Yeah. I can't tell you
You also
how.
mentioned class,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that's a major division in the Filipino American community. The higher the class, the more conservative. Okay,
right.
and then
Well, yeah.
there's generation. Okay, and when I said Filipinx, my point was that the people who are going back to the Philippines and joining indigenous movements as well as liberal constitutional movements, right, political movements, right, those people that are taking their risk are in their 20s and 30s.
Wow.
Most of them are in their 30 years old, right? Some of them were former students, uh,
So the sons and daughters of people who immigrated here in the 80s or the 2000s.
did somebody else had one of their sons, I believe, killed in the Philippines. Was that Sherry? Did she?
I don't know. I
Okay.
don't recall.
Well, this is really recent. I mean,
Oh,
it
I
just
don't
happened in the
recall
last couple
seeing
of weeks.
that. But I can see that. I mean, I can see things like that happening where people who are immigrants from the say 2000s or the 80s, they have offspring, or they have young. Here's another typical way: people are born in the Philippines and then come here as young children,
Right.
and in that case, this might explain the high number of undocumented Filipinos who overstay
Right.
and don't get their papers, you know, don't apply for citizenship because of backlogs. And in fact, there's a growing number of undocumented Filipinos who are very vocal about this, you know, very vocal on issues like DACA, deferred action on early childhood arrivals. And it's a part of our community. It's a part of that's, you know, more than 60% of
Right.
those born in the Philippines. So once again, I mean, I have heard about this idea of unity, or what constitutes unity in the Filipino American community, ever since I was a little boy on my daddy's knee, who came in 1928, right?
Right.
And thinking that, okay, one day, and watching Alex Escalmado up on stage at the Civic Center in San Francisco with his NAFA or his FAPA, you know, all the different organizations he had, thinking, you know, one day we will have unity. One day we will have you know, we will be united as a group. And here I am on the verge of being an elder, thinking, I guess it's not going to happen in my generation.
What do you mean, verge?
Oh, okay, thanks
You,
a
you
lot,
made
Dan.
it. You made it, dude. You
Oh,
old.
thank you, Dan. Yeah, thanks. But no, but the thing is, I don't know if it's going to happen. Even, I mean, I'm glad to see a number of Filipino Americans step up and do the participatory democracy thing. We have T.J. Cox, who's in the Central Valley, you know, running for Congress again. We've got there's a young LGBTQ candidate in Texas, you know, who's got great credentials and has a good shot of winning, replacing um, Will Hurd. You know, his when he retired,
Yep.
she's going up for that district. So there are people who want to play that game. Where do you see people? You see a lot of young people now at, you know, from your perch at San Francisco State. Do people want to play that game? Are there more Filipinos now saying, yeah, I'm a part of this? Because I guess the premise of our conversation thus far today has been, well, maybe we're looking at we're looking to be effective anywhere. We're looking to be effective any place where we can have a voice. And some people might say, if I have a voice in the Philippines and Philippine politics, that's where I want to go. That's where I want to say, or that's where I want to be active. What do you see from your perch as a professor at SF State?
Yeah, there's a lot more activism now, and a lot of it is because of the influence of BLM, among other things. Uh, the also reaction to Trump.
Mm.
Uh, there's a whole lot of moral and ethical issues with some of the immigration policies. You would think, right, that the older generation, established first generation immigrants, would also be critical of Trump administration because of their treatment of immigrants at the southern border, especially the separation of children from parents because of the very strong family orientation in Filipino culture.
Right.
But Filipinos tend to be able to show themselves as being different from others. So, for example, while the civil rights movement was increasing in scope and depth during the late 50s and through the 60s, very few Filipinos identified with it. And in fact, there were many Filipinos who were really critical of
Is that the
the
case?
Black
I mean,
civil rights movement.
I'm trying to put together in my mind how I saw, because to me, my reference point for Filipino activism in the 60s is always Alex Escalmado, who was the publisher and editor of the Philippine News. And it
Yeah,
seems instead of civil rights, he was out there. I know he was marched. I know he had a belief for civil rights and for economic equality, and he was anti-discrimination. But when he marched, he was anti-Marcos. Marcos was the issue.
he was only anti-Marcos after the Lopez's got persecuted. He was not anti-Marcos with great strength until the Marcoses went after members of the Lopez family. And so, Alex had Mr. Esclamado, I should say. I don't want to be too familiar, but Mr. Esclamado saved a lot of money by having the Philippine news printed in the Philippines. He didn't have a press here. And that's how he was able to run the newspaper from the lower level of his house in the Sunset before they got their own office, right? And then they had downtown office, and then they moved that out to South San Francisco, right? Right. But he never had a press here for at least.
He ultimately did, though. I think.
So he got it. He got it. No. They did the layout here. They did the flats here, and then they put them on. Either sent them by courier, or via the consulate to the Philippines. Had them printed there and then shipped back here.
It's amazing how, all this was in pre-digital times.
And his relationship was very strong with the Lopezes. And so when Marcos started persecuting the Lopezes, was when Mr. Esclamado obviously developed a very strong position. And as a result of that, he was, in fact, in his newspaper, and other members of his family were persecuted by the Marcos government. And he had a lawsuit, over those issues,
But your point was that Filipinos weren't part and parcel of the civil rights era protests.
No, in fact, many of them were very conservative. They're really critical of the civil rights movement. They would say, they would use the N-word, and they would say, most people would not use the N-word. They'd use colored people. They would
look, hey, come on, look, I grew up in San Francisco's, well, ultimately in the Mission, but early on in the Western Addition in the Fillmore. And my father, when through the years, Filipinos lived where they could live, and generally that was with the blacks.
That's right.
In the Fillmore. And as I grew up, I remember at least how to say negative things about blacks in at least 3 dialects. I know at least 3.
We will not review those now.
But this is part of the racism that kind of existed within.
Yeah.
And it's sad to say that, but that's the reality. I mean, but you should hear what my dad said about Italians. I mean, it was kind of like it really was a very highly Darwinistic kind of thing where, there
were ethnic geographic lines in the city. If you were Chinese, you did not cross the line over into Little Italy. I mean, Stockton Street was the cutoff, and there was a little bit of marginality on that one block, right, of Grant Street above Stockton, right, but before Columbus.
So you're talking for people who don't know San Francisco geography, you're talking about
Chinatown,
the line between Chinatown and North Beach, or Chinatown and
which was still very strong Italian, because the produce market was still located over there.
Right.
They didn't move it out to the east side of the freeway out there, at the Bayview. They didn't move that out there until the 60s.
But you all right, so you say that the Filipinos weren't very big in the civil rights movement.
No.
I know some labor people out there might disagree, but because
there were some people who were, but they were all on the left.
Right.
Most of the people who supported the civil rights movement came from the left, and the Filipino left was very small. It was union people, labor-oriented people. It was more highly educated people, and a lot of them were the people that were born before the Second World War, who lived, as you said, in the Fillmore. I mean, they had an organization called the Mangoes, right? That was part of that.
Mangoes. It's a big thing, the Mangoes.
And they were really very accomplished. They became very accomplished, and in fact, it was most of the people who were directly supportive of the movement to establish Filipino American studies as part of ethnic studies at San Francisco State were members of the Mangos.
Right.
They were all highly accomplished, all finished advanced degrees in college. Two of them were members of the San Francisco Unified School District Administration. One was Rod McLeod's mom.
Oh, yeah.
Bonnie.
No, not Bonnie.
No,
Bonnie's
Bonnie's sister.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
yeah, Mrs. McLeod.
Julita.
So the Mangos, I remember the Mangos, and I think, you know,
she was a principal.
Fred Vasconcelio, he was a Mango.
Yes, he was.
And because I remember we're talking to him about Vicky Dre's Manalo, I think maybe she was even a Mango.
I don't know.
But the Mangos were that was a big thing growing up in San Francisco, and they had basketball leagues and all that. You know, Dan, I have a question here from a viewer who's tuning into Facebook Live.
Did we answer the first question well enough? You know.
Well, we touched on it about civil rights, or
no. The first question was, that a lot of Filipinos wanted the Philippines to become a 51st state.
Right,
and that came up again during martial law, and then it came up again, I think, after Aquino, but before Estrada.
Well, look at it this way: the Philippines was sold to the U.S. And you know, for 20 million.
Yeah.
And the U.S. did not, the U.S. gave independence to the Philippines ultimately, but Puerto Rico, the U.S. has kept. Is the Philippines better for being not Puerto Rico in this after the Spanish-American War scenario?
You know, the reason people prize independence is the potential, right? For the potential of self-government. All right. And to throw off the yoke of colonialism, to be able to exercise their own sovereignty, right? Their national sovereignty. And the Philippines did a good job of that, right? Before the Second World War. And because of the Depression, right, the United States was interested in dropping anything that it saw as a liability, right? And that was during the Depression. Okay, so remember, they signed off on Philippine independence, right, in the mid-1930s during the Depression.
Well, I mean, but look at what happened to Puerto Rico. I mean, they got hit by the hurricane, and Trump went through some.
They have a statehood movement too. Yeah.
I mean, but I'm saying is that did the Philippines do better?
Yeah.
Is it better off than Puerto Rico? Because we could have been like Puerto Rico, where we are citizens but not cared for.
Well, potentially yes, especially in the first 10 years. Between 46 and 56, even you might even be able to go as far as 1960 or so. But that first 10 to 15 year period was very promising for the Philippines. And in fact, because Japan had been bombed out, okay, the Philippines had the strongest economy in all of Asia in that first decade. Yeah. You know, there are some great black and white movies that were made in the Philippines at that time. You know, not the corny stuff or the semi porn, you know, the soft porn.
See, the Philippines,
it's really good dramas and artistically refined film. Okay.
Yeah.
But then you get this class takeover, and the upper class really looks down on common tao, right? And that's the majority of the people.
But you know, the Philippines would kill if they had something equal to K-pop or something. They would kill if they had something equal to BTS, you know, instead of, there's a Bomba girl.
They actually could. We have the talent. It's obviously we have the talent to do that. We don't have the discipline.
Yeah,
We
we
don't have
have.
the
Yeah,
discipline. And the people who want to get rich off it, right? Take a huge cut. It's just like the record industry, the music industry here in the United States. There's been this whole revolution possible that favors artists because they can go independent from record companies, right?
yeah,
But man, when I was playing bands, it was, record companies were sharks.
yeah.
They, even people like Santana, they were selling their albums for 10 grand each. Each of them got 10 grand. I remember when Jorge and Carlos got new cars. They went out and bought Volvo P1800s. Remember the sports car, the two-door
Oh
sports car?
yeah, yeah. That little
They went
sleek
out and got,
Volvo.
I'll tell you, Carlos is still very consistent though. He likes dark green.
Hey, Dan, look. We're talking with Professor Dan Gonzales here from San Francisco State University. If you're here with us on the Facebook Live from the virtual FANHS Museum, we're doing this because we're closed again, but we're not closed. We're really not closed. We're in a closet, and we're doing this conversation with
Yeah,
you.
Emil's in the closet. I expect he's going to come out sexually soon.
Thank you very much for being here. We're going to continue. We're not stopping. I'm just saying, I'm just acknowledging you for being there. And if you have a question, put it in a little box there in the question box, and we will get to I will get to, if we get to the low double digits, like a little bit more viewers, I'll start going to your questions. I have a few more questions of my own for Dan, but if we can get our number up a little higher, I'll go and ask Willie's question or Elena's question or Carolyn's question. So tell your friends on Facebook to come watch us here, that we're through with our technical glitch. Hey, Dan, so here's a question I want to ask you. I want to bring it forward all the way. Today's, I was talking to the AAPI data folks. They said most of the Asians are Democrats, and by a wide margin, 59 to 24, they're for Biden.
Right.
And in the past, in the recent past, the last 4 years, Filipinos were among the Trumpiest, but now they seem to have joined the majority of AAPI.
It's a good sign.
To the 59-24. This is the latest release by AAPI data. What do you think is happening here? Do you think, I imagine that the class thing is why there were a lot of Trumpy Filipino Americans, but what do you think is going on?
A lot of the Trumpy Filipino Americans are like the Trumpy white folks. Remember when the huge movement in favor of Trump, even though the Hillary polls were very strong in her favor, and they a lot of the analysts and the commentators on TV said, yeah, it's working class white folks, non-college educated, right? And they ignored the fact that the Tea Party were a bunch of people driving over to DC in Winnebagos. What working class people, right, had the time to take off work and go out in Winnebagos that cost 25 grand, 30 grand a pop, right?
Those are the small ones too.
Yeah. And so I was saying, no, man. There's a large population that are middle class, middle of the United States, right, or from the South, right? So that's who they were. Now compare that to Filipinos. You got a lot of Filipino working class that were in favor of Trump for a variety of different reasons, but the classic reasons that people favor the Republican Party against the Democrats is not about class. It's about religion. Okay. Anti-gay, anti-abortion, right at the top of the list. Okay. And so they see all of this flag waving going on the right, and particularly in the Republican Party. And they see the corruption being associated with Hillary, most of which is fake. I mean, it's mythology, but it's partially true. I mean, I don't like what they do with their money and their foundation, right? Their Clinton Foundation and all that stuff. But nowhere near the level of corruption that New Yorkers knew about Trump. And that's the problem. Trump had a TV image that was national and even international. And the reality of Trump was only known by the locals in New York. Okay. Uh,
Or
so,
Atlantic City.
okay.
I mean,
So Filipinos went along with that,
right.
and they bought into it for a variety of reasons. Yeah, what cracked me up was the Republicans played up this whole thing about Trump being a man of the people and all that, and then criticizing the Hollywood elites and the billionaire, Democrats and all that, which is true, right? A lot of the people are very wealthy and all the rest of that stuff, but what the hell, what are the Koch brothers? Why are so many of the Republicans in the Senate also multi-millionaires, right? Why do they have all these crooked connections with other countries? Half of those people are in conflict of interest, just like the Trump family is, because they never divorced themselves from their businesses, in violation not only of the emoluments clause, but straight up conflict of interest.
Yeah.
But what,
Yeah.
now they're seeing it out in the open, and even though they might not understand, all of the principles involved, and they might not be familiar with it, all of the various and sundry ways that the Trump administration has violated the Constitution, right, outright. Okay, they may not know all of those ways, and to the degree at which they violated the Constitution, but they just see the morality, the immorality of the situation.
Or as we like to point out, the allegations of those violations, and not necessarily proven. We want to stay nonpartisan, but
see, some of the things that have been done right out in public.
Well, that's true.
Just that they haven't been tried.
Right. Well, and just like
gone that far.
How about
certain members have been tried and they've been convicted?
And how about
7 have been convicted, another 8th is charged now, Bannon.
Yeah. I mean, now it was almost like as if on cue, the Democrats have their convention, and then Trump has one of his former associates indicted. So it sort of set up the Democrats to say, hey, look at what a good guy our guy is. And I don't know what the Republicans are going to say this coming week.
Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing if Kamala was one of the reasons that people made the decision, or how early they made their decision, because many of them may have made their decision to support Biden, months ago, even before he made his pick for Veep.
Yeah. Do you think Harris is a plus for Filipino Americans, or do you think? I mean,
I think she is. I think she is because she's a Californian, and she's a Northern Californian, so she's really familiar with all of the different groups in California. She also, worked as the Attorney General of the state, and there's a lot of Filipinos on their staff up there in Sacramento, and down here their offices on McAllister, right? They've got and on the other side that's mostly bureaucratic, but the law offices, the political offices on McAllister Street, there's a lot of Filipinos there, and so she's interacted with all of the major population groups in California, and she's very familiar with their political and cultural circumstances. It's kind of like Obama, right? Because Obama spent some time in Hawaii in his life. He's familiar with the cultures. He's comfortable and knowledgeable as well. So I think Kamala, as an individual, is well prepared. Whether or not Filipinos recognize that, that's a different thing.
Well, also, look, I don't want to make it sound like an endorsement. I was just only pointing out that this was an historic selection.
Yeah.
An Indian, or she has Indian parentage. She's Indian and Black parentage.
Jamaican.
Jamaican, yeah, and India. And I was just wondering what this says. Does this hurt Filipino prospects in terms of, Kamala's Indian, and right now in the ranks of in the population ranks, it's Chinese, Filipino, Indian.
Yeah.
Indian coming up. So
Okay.
we're kind of in competition there with our Indian brothers and
Yeah, but they got
sisters.
an economic base that's a screamer, man.
Well, I'm just
You know?
pointing out that it seems like are the Filipinos going to be eclipsed now with Harris being named as, vice presidential candidate?
Well,
And
we've already been eclipsed from a political economic point of view. We've already been eclipsed. Have you seen how many Indians run for office successfully? I
yeah,
mean, who beat Congressman Honda out
right.
right in the South Bay, right? And he's being very progressive and very active. You know,
A little bit, but it took him a while. If you're talking about Ro Khanna, it took him a little while to figure out that he's not Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He's taken his time, and he wasn't always as vocal. And a lot of Asian Americans were a little upset that he wanted to jump the line and be Honda's heir before Honda was ready. I mean, this is not the first time this sort of thing has happened in Asian American politics. It happens in Hawaii a lot, actually.
right.
With Dan Akaka, who was senator, and he was challenged by Case. So I only mention this not as an endorsement of Kamala Harris, but to say, boy, what's going to happen to the Filipino prospects in politics, or because of the premise of everything we've said today, we sort of like look to the Philippines. We're not really into our local politics or our U.S. politics as much. Maybe we get what we deserve. This is, people don't run. Some people run, but we're not as involved. How do you see it, Dan?
Well, there's a lot of younger people now. People, if you take a look at Daly City, where we have a strong population that was able to unite around a whole set of candidates. I mean, there's a period there where three people with two of them outright Filipino on both sides of the family and one half Filipino, that were all on city council at the same time. And a couple of them have been, there's a potential for having 3.5 Filipinos on the city council at the same time, a majority of Filipinos, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not just the fact that we've got a strong population in terms of numbers. It's also competence, right? It's also about competence. Many people tried to run for office in Daly City all throughout the 80s, and they weren't, in my opinion, competent. Okay, it took Mike Gingona. Okay,
right.
Who comes from a very political family, very well known throughout the Manila, Metro Manila, and all that, and maybe beyond. But he was very competent. He was a former public defender. And practicing attorney. I think he's kind of semi-retired now, but
he's running again.
Yeah, and all chances are he might win. Yeah. So.
I mean, it's funny though. Once again, with Gingona, Mike Gingona, he has a very Manila-based political connection.
Yep.
His father was high up in the. He was vice president, right?
I can't. No, I don't know.
But he was high up in Filipino politics. Mike is local Bay Area guy who is the mayor of Daly City, accomplished local politician. Now he's going for supervisor. He's got a shot. He's Filipino. I was talking to Thelma Buckholt, or Ty Buckholt, Thelma's daughter, yesterday, and she was telling me about her mother, who was the first Filipino legislator elected to a state house anywhere in the U.S. And she said, my mom was not running courting Filipinos because Alaska was 90% white. The district she represented was 90% white. In fact, they wanted her to run because she was she knew the communities, the indigenous communities there. and they wanted her to connect with them, not the Filipinos. So it's one of those things where being Filipino isn't necessarily it. Isn't let's see, we got a
I don't
question.
know. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Are you there?
Okay.
Okay, I got a question.
I'm having, all of a sudden now I'm having speaker problems.
Uh-oh.
So I don't know what happened.
But you can hear me, right?
I'm trying to see whether or not I get my other camera to work.
Okay.
I'm going to shut it down and see if I can get my sound back. Hold on a second.
Okay. All right. Well, once again, we have these technical difficulties.
Okay.
But if you're out there listening, I really truly appreciate you hanging in there.
Mute sound. Please come back.
I can hear you, Dan.
No, I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me. Oh. Well, it's
Bummer, man.
yeah. What happened? I think one of the cameras went down. One of your
You can
cameras.
see that.
And well, this is a Facebook Live. This
Ain't
happened.
Facebook wonderful?
It's okay though. It's okay because we've been talking. Well, you can't hear me at all. Okay.
Yeah, I can't hear you, so you're gonna have to sign.
Oh God!
Or
you can't see me. Well, look, I think we have gone.
What happened.
We've gone.
How much time do we have?
Well, I just thought
Show me fingers.
I just thought I'd go as long as you.
Show me fingers. Everything but the middle one.
Okay. No. Can you see my camera? I'm waving my hand. We're good, but if we have a technical issue, I think we can shut down now. Although we weren't able to get to one of the questions.
Yeah, I don't know why.
But you can't hear me, right? Can you hear me? No, he cannot hear me. Okay, well, we shall say goodbye to Daniel Phil Gonzales, professor of Asian American Studies at the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. If you've been listening, we've been talking about Filipino American history. We've been talking about the political situation with Filipinos. How do we explain where Filipinos are? We went back to the pre-colonial days, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and trying to understand why what's happening now is happening now. We have one party has an Asian American who's running for vice president. We have another party that many Filipino Americans have supported, and we have finished one convention, the Democrats. We go to the Republicans next, and it should be interesting to see how they differ. Once again, we're nonpartisan. We don't take sides, but we just try to explain the history and the evolution of our Filipino American political situation. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. We usually have programs like this throughout the year. We've been closed since March, but we decided we're going to do this. We're going to have these virtual programs, and I promise we'll minimize the glitches going forward. But if you hung in there till now, thank you very much. Add a thing in the chat, what we've done. You can also, if you missed any part of this, you can go to the live section of the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum and look at the full tape. Probably give it about 10, 15 minutes and the tape will be there so you can go and look at that. I just want to remind you, we do this every third Sunday, but every now and then we do these pop-ups. Yesterday we talked to Thelma Buckholt's daughter, Ty Buckholt, about being the first Filipino American woman to be elected to a state house in the U.S. So you can catch that on our Facebook page. And if you have any other suggestions about people we can talk to, about programs that we can have, we're going to do one on the Far West Conference coming up, just as a little tease. But certainly you can email me at filipinomuseum@gmail.com. That's filipinomuseum@gmail.com, or leave a message in chat. My name is Emil Guillermo. We're trying to do this for you because I know that many of you would love to come see our museum, would love to come see us, see the things we have on display. The Tony Dezunega art exhibit I thought was going to be a real crowd pleaser. We have his, he's the Marvel and DC comic artist. And we thought, boy, that would be great to begin or kick off the year. We had it set to go in March, and since March, we've been shut down. So hopefully this will satisfy, or keep you satisfied for now. We want to do more. So send me your suggestions about people to talk to, about issues to talk about, and we will have them here on our virtual pop-ups. So thanks again. I'm Emil Guillermo. Have yourselves a good rest of the day, and check again next time. When we have these things, sometimes they just appear on our Facebook page and it says, hey, we're going to talk to Joey Tobacco. We are. All you Joey Tobacco fans, we're going to be talking to him soon and talking to people all around the country here on these Filipino American National Historical Society Museum pop-ups. Thanks again. Take care.